2022 was more than 10 degrees Celsius. That means the 10 warmest years on record in this country have all been in the past 2 decades. Clear proof, say scientists, of dramatic climate change. Here's our climate editor, Justin Rowlett.
Remember the hot summer with those record-breaking high temperatures? Well, it wasn't just the summer that was hot. The spring, the autumn and the winter was too. In fact, every month except December was hotter than average. So why are we seeing these record temperatures? The answer is climate change, according to the Met Office. It calculates that without human-induced global warming, we would expect a year as warm as last year once every 500 years. In the current climate, we can expect one every 3 or 4 years. And last year's mild temperatures are part of a long-term pattern. This graph shows the coldest and hottest years ever recorded in the UK. All the hottest years are within the last 2 decades, and you can see this year tops them all with an average temperature of 10.03 degrees Celsius, the first time UK average annual temperatures have topped 10 degrees.
The planet is warming up as a consequence of climate change due to the emissions of greenhouse gases. And as the world is warming, we are seeing that reflected in our own statistics for UK weather and climate. So our climate here in the UK has warmed by about 1 degree on average.
Last year's record temperatures drove wildfires. Houses in Dartford, Kent were consumed in the flames. Droughts affected agriculture and left many reservoirs with unusually low water levels. Water shortages led to hosepipe bans in some parts of the UK. Meanwhile, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. Last year is expected to have been the 4th or 5th hottest year ever recorded worldwide, and climate scientists believe this year is likely to continue that trend. Justin Rowlett, BBC News.
Joining us now, Richard Miller, Head of Adaptation at the Climate Change Committee, an independent body that advises UK governments on emissions targets and reports on efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and adapt to a changing climate. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. How can you tease out to what extent climate change is responsible for these figures we've just been talking about?
Well, as the piece showed, this year is a record-breaking year in terms of UK temperatures, but it's part of this overall pattern. We see this sort of continual increase in UK temperatures over the last several decades. And of course, different years are particularly warm, some a bit colder than average, but that sort of pattern overall that we see rising in that figure that we saw on the piece shows that pattern quite clearly. There are sort of complicated modelling techniques that can really start to tease out exactly how likely we're to see a year like this without climate change, which was about 1 in 500. But that effect of loading the dice that human emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere has caused means that that's actually more like a 1 in 3 year event now. We see the temperatures we saw last year about 1 in 3 years instead of 1 in 500, and that's due to human influence on climate.
We're looking at some pictures of the damage caused when wildfires break out. This was in East London in August last year. What are some of the other effects, negative effects, that we're seeing to do with rising temperatures in the UK?
Well, I think 2022, we saw a lot of different weather happening in the UK across the year. And I think some of those things were exactly the kinds of things we need to be mindful of when planning for climate change in the future. The drought that we saw across large bits of England, for instance, has large implications on agriculture, but also on nature. So a key task really for society, but led by government, needs to be to think about how do we design the kinds of policies and actions that we're taking to do things like try and reach net zero, which means storing more carbon in the land and using our land in a more effective way, as well as restoring nature to it. How do we do that in a way that's going to be compatible with these kinds of more frequent, more intense heat extremes that we saw this year and we'll see increasingly in the future? That's the kind of planning and thinking we need right across society to really start to adequately prepare for the kinds of climates we know we're going to be seeing in 10 years, but also further beyond to 20, 30, 50 years' time.
The Met Office says that a UK mean temperature of 10 degrees Celsius would have been expected once in 500 years in an unaffected climate, if you can call it that. But they now say it's likely to occur every 3 to 4 years due to emissions. So you're talking about adaptation and mitigation. How well are we doing with that?
So I think we're making a good start in the UK, but both on reducing emissions and adapting to climate change, there's a lot more to do. On reducing emissions, we have these set of targets that will start to reduce our greenhouse gases down to reach net zero by 2050. And that's absolutely what we need to be doing in the UK to end our contribution to climate change. But even while we're doing that, we know that the world's going to keep warming for around 30 years or so, or at least as long as it takes the world to get its emissions down to net zero. So we know that there's several decades of future climate change here in the UK that's going to mean some of those things we saw in 2022, like the extreme heat in the summer, reaching 40 degrees more often with that impact on people's lives, but also on infrastructure and our homes. We're going to see that regularly in the future. So that's the kind of thing we know we need to be planning for now. And there's more that we can do to really increase our attention on that bit of the problem. And that does mean, I think, taking a sort of whole of society approach to thinking about how do we factor a changing climate into everything we're doing, be it in government or in the private sector, and having a much clearer vision of what we're trying to achieve in adapting the UK. It'd be really valuable to have this sense of where we want to go. There's still positive vision of what our life could look like in 20, 30 years' time, where we're better adapted to climate change, and we've also reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. And setting out that vision, some targets that can really mean that government's efforts to reach that can be held to account is one of the key things I think we'd like to see from the government in its next National Adaptation Programme, which is due this summer.
Richard Miller from the Climate Change Committee, thank you.